All right. Hi, everyone. Excited to be here today. Thank you, Cody, for that introduction. As he said, my name is Mariah Baker. I'm a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow in Congress. I'm really excited to be here. This is my first SGx conference, so I was very grateful for the invitation and the opportunity to speak to you guys today. So, being the congressional speaker today, I figured it would be appropriate to title my talk, A Journey Through Space to Capitol Hill. A little bit of context here. When I asked the moderators what they wanted me to talk about, they said it would be great to talk about my fellowship and my experience working on the Hill, including how I got here. So this got me thinking, oh, how did I get here? How did I end up working in space policy on Capitol Hill? We are having difficulty staying on this slide. All right, here we go. If you can't tell, this is the Capitol building. While this little NASA movie plays, I'm just going to give a little preface here. Thinking about this question a little bit more, the first thing that came to mind was how I often have friends and family remark about how cool it is that I work in space and how it's awesome that I'm passionate about my work. And they're totally right. I love what I do. I feel very grateful to get to do this and to work in space. I love space. I love talking about space. I love exploring space. But it was never totally clear to me how that would manifest itself into a career. So while understanding that everybody's path is different and they're usually not particularly linear, I'm just going to take you on a brief journey through space and time on my own experiences getting into space policy and a little bit of what I've learned along the way. So I'll keep it brief, but hopefully you find this interesting and ideally informative as well. Okay, so we're going to start really far away at the edge of the Milky Way galaxy, 200,000 light years away. For those of you who don't have your conversion charts handy, that's about 10 to the 18th miles. So we are very far away from Capitol Hill at this point. But this is where I started. My first kind of foray into space was as an undergrad at Haverford College, which despite its small size actually had an incredible astronomy program and an observatory on campus with a 12 and a 16-inch telescope. So that was pretty cool and unique. And I took my first astronomy class, sitting there deriving equations on the chalkboard in the old observatory, and decided I wanted to major in astrophysics. So while I was there, I got to write my senior thesis on Milky Way dwarf galaxies, and I also had the opportunity to lead Haverford's public observing program, which brought members of the community into the observatory to use the telescope and to do experiments and to just learn about space generally. So it became pretty clear pretty quickly to me the power that space had to inspire people of all ages, of all races, of all backgrounds. People were just captivated by space. And honestly, I was too. I loved the research. I loved the outreach. It felt like there was a lot more to explore, both literally out in space and with regards to how we engaged in space exploration as a society and as a species, and in turn, how those space exploration missions impacted our lives here on Earth. So, was really into astrophysics, felt like I was on the right track doing something I loved. But to be quite honest, staring at specks of light hundreds of thousands of light years away felt a little intangible sometimes. So I pivoted a little bit into planetary science, which, no pun intended, felt a little closer to home. I had the opportunity to work on NASA's Mars missions as a graduate student and later as a postdoc at the Smithsonian, which was just an incredible opportunity to really be working at the forefront of planetary exploration. My personal research involved looking at images taken by rovers and landers and using them to understand how wind was blowing sand and dust around on the surface, which sounds pretty niche, but it actually had really important implications for understanding the geologic and climatic history of Mars. And so it was really, really cool to be involved in that. For me, though, actually, the cooler part of my research was the implications it had for surface operations, for mission planning, and in particular, for mitigating risks to robotic instruments and potentially for future human explorers on the surface. Anyone who has seen the first scene in The Martian gets some sort of sense of why this might be important, although I will caveat that that is Hollywood's version, so take that with a grain of salt. But regardless, being kind of involved in this sort of applied research really got me thinking about how we are using the information that researchers are learning about Mars now to feed into the next generation of missions. So to try to kind of explore this question a little bit more, I took on an internship at NASA headquarters while I was getting my postdoc. And I was able to work on a project there where basically we were using orbital and landed data that was being collected currently to guide future human missions there and to assess possible human landing sites. Obviously, there's a lot more we need to do before we can put humans on the surface of Mars safely, but this was my first experience really bridging the gap between science and policy. And using a term that I'm sure people have heard before, it was my first chance seeing science for policy and in turn policy for science. And kind of exploring that symbiotic relationship between the two really got me excited about exploring that intersection a little bit more. Okay, so now we're getting a lot closer to Capitol Hill. Decided I really wanted to dive into the policy side of things a little bit. So I decided to take classes at GW's Space Policy Institute, which I know many of you have done as well. Got some fans back there. So this was a really exciting opportunity for me because I got to look at the missions that I was involved in a completely different light and kind of understand the broader societal and economic and geopolitical implications of space exploration. And it became clear, looking at it through this new lens, that space exploration was so much more than a scientific endeavor. Space exploration promotes economic growth and STEM engagement, international collaboration, and competition. It really touched on so many different facets of society. And so I found it really interesting, to kind of explore those new dimensions of space that I had never been part of before. So this motivated me to apply for the AAAS Policy Fellowship. And now we have arrived at our destination. I arrived on Capitol Hill last October, and in a lot of ways, Congress was more foreign to me than Mars was. I felt like a total fish out of water, wasn't sure what to do with myself, but I learned pretty quickly that policymaking on the Hill wasn't actually all that different from a high-stakes planetary mission. You've got sort of a long-term strategic goal in mind that you've got to take incremental steps to get to. Things can change